There is a night in the autumn of 1940 that does not appear in most histories of the air war over Britain. It does not appear because nothing was destroyed. No factory burned, no dock was breached, no residential street collapsed into rubble. What happened instead was this. A formation of German bombers committed to a night raid on the industrial infrastructure of Bristol found a fire burning in the Somerset countryside, decided that fire was their target, and dropped their entire bomb load into an empty field on the Mendip Hills. One of the first decoy sites had been constructed on Black Down, in the Mendip Hills, codenamed Starfish, built to protect the city of Bristol. The bombers returned across the channel. Their navigators logged the mission as successful. Their bomb aimers noted the fires they had followed and the impact patterns they had observed from altitude. The raid on Bristol, in every record that mattered to Luftwaffe planning staff, had been conducted and completed. Bristol was 12 miles away. It was dark and intact and breathing. The men who built that fire in the field knew the bombers might come. They had calibrated the blaze precisely for that purpose. They had studied how cities look when they burn. They had measured the light from altitude, accounted for the spread of flame across rooftops, simulated the glow that bleeds into low cloud and becomes a landmark visible for 40 miles. And then they had built something that looked, from 6,000 meters, exactly like a city already dying. They were not soldiers. They were not scientists in any grand institutional sense. Many of them were civilian contractors, electricians, engineers, construction workers, sitting in a concrete bunker in the Somerset dark, listening for aircraft engines, waiting for the signal to light the array. The bombers came. The fire went up. The bombs fell on grass and stone and nothing that mattered. This is the story of the Starfish program. It is a story about deception at the most fundamental level of warfare, not the deception of commanders or intelligence services, but the deception of human perception itself, the deception of a bomb aimer's eyes. And it is a story about what an engineer with an unconventional mind can accomplish when the problem he is handed is one that guns cannot solve. To understand what the Starfish program was built to defeat, you have to understand what the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign of 1940 had become by autumn of that year, and what made it so difficult to counter through conventional means. Germany had entered the war with a significant advantage in one specific area of aviation technology: radio navigation for night operations. Prior to effective British countermeasures, the Knickerbein and X-Jet systems significantly enhanced the Luftwaffe's night bombing precision during the early phases of the Blitz in 1940 and 1941. These beam navigation aids allowed Pathfinder units like Kampfgeschwader 100 to mark targets accurately, enabling follow-on bombers to concentrate their attacks. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Radio transmitters on the European coast projected narrow beams across the Channel and across England. A bomber crew flying along one beam or navigating to the intersection of two beams knew with considerable precision where they were. They did not need to see the ground. They did not need stars or landmarks. The mathematics of the signal told them everything. The special role as Pathfinder unit involved equipping Heinkel 111s with the highly secret X-Jet radio navigation device, an automatic bombing guidance system based on radio beams. The aircraft of Kampfgruppe 100 carried this equipment when the main bomber force did not. The X-Jet operated on a much higher frequency than Knickerbein and required new radio equipment, which was in short supply and could not be installed in all bombers, so the experimental unit Kampfgruppe 100 was given the task of using its X-Jet equipment to guide other aircraft to the target. To do this, KGR-100 aircraft attacked as an initial small group, dropping flares which other aircraft would then see and bomb visually. Fire. That was the crucial element. Once the Pathfinders had passed over a target and dropped, their incendiaries, the marker fires they ignited, became the navigation system for every aircraft that followed. The beams had guided the Pathfinders, but the Pathfinders' fires guided the stream, and fire from altitude is unmistakable. Getting closer, bomber crews described a target burning so brightly it could be seen from 100 miles away. There was no ambiguity. There was no uncertainty. A burning city center is a beacon. It pulses with its own heat and light, and it is visible through cloud and weather and the particular murk of an English winter night in a way that no blackout regulation can entirely suppress. Britain had understood blackout discipline from the first weeks of the war. The problem with night bombing is that the same limitations in visibility made it difficult for bomb aimers to find their targets, especially a blacked-out target at night. Only the largest targets, cities, could be attacked with any probability of success. But this observation contained a trap that British civil defense planners were still calculating in the late summer of 1940. Blackout worked, but only until the first incendiaries landed. The moment a Pathfinder aircraft ignited even a small fire in a city center, the blackout became irrelevant. The city had announced itself. The Luftwaffe had flown some 300 miles in darkness from bases in northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands to blind bomb their targets, achieving great accuracy by following the beam. But the second phase of a raid required no beam at all. It required only fire, and fire, once it existed, was a problem that belonged entirely to the perceptual domain, not the physical one. You could not shoot it down. You could not intercept it. You could not jam it the way the brilliant scientists of British scientific intelligence were learning to jam the radio transmissions that preceded it. The fire was already there, and every aircraft that followed the Pathfinders was flying toward it. This was the WWII doctrine, and it was working. More than 500 bombers blitzed Coventry on the night of November 14, 1940, starting a firestorm that brought about a temporary collapse of social order. Large sections of the West Midlands industrial city were flattened in the raid. The Pathfinders had found their target with extraordinary precision. The fires they started guided the bomber stream, and by morning, Coventry was a ruin. The problem, as Britain's civil defense authorities understood it in the weeks that followed, was not the bombers. It was not even the beams. It was the moment of decision, that fraction of time when a bomb aimer, flying over England in darkness, looked down, saw fire, and decided where he was. That moment was the hinge point of the entire system. Everything else, the navigation, the approach, the bomb release, served that single act of visual identification. And that act was happening, night after night, over Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool, Sheffield, Cardiff, over every city whose industrial profile had been identified in German pre-war reconnaissance and logged in Luftwaffe target folders. Subscribe if you want more hidden World War II histories told carefully. The conventional instruments of air defense could address many problems. They could not address this one. Barrage balloons were tethered at altitudes designed to force bombers higher, degrading their bombing accuracy and exposing them to greater risk from anti-aircraft fire. They were effective against low-level attacks. They were less effective against aircraft flying above their ceiling, which the Heinkel crews of the Pathfinder formations routinely did. The balloons rose into the dark and bristled around city perimeters, and the bombers flew above them and looked down through the gap. Anti-aircraft guns were a psychological instrument as much as a physical one. They forced aircraft higher, yes. They imposed a cost on Luftwaffe operations, yes. But the gun batteries defending Bristol in the autumn of 1940 were firing into darkness at aircraft they could not see, guided by sound locators whose accuracy degraded with distance and was defeated by cloud. The guns made noise. They made the sky uncomfortable. They did not, with any regularity, change the fundamental calculation of where a German bomb aimer decided he was flying over. And blackout, for all its rigor and its cost, the cost measured in the lives of pedestrians who stepped off curbs in the dark, the cost measured in the exhaustion of air raid wardens walking blacked-out streets, blackout could only delay the identification of a target. It could not prevent it once the fire started. When the air raid began, it was vital to enforce the blackout of all lights in the genuine target area and wait until the first wave of aircraft had gone home, while frantic attempts were made to extinguish the early fires they had caused. This was the arithmetic that civil defense teams were performing on every raid night throughout the autumn of 1940. Extinguish the fires before the main bomber stream arrived, force the bomb aimers to search in darkness. Buy time. But fire services in a bombed city center were operating under their own conditions of chaos. Burst water mains, blocked streets, secondary fires from shattered gas lines. The mathematics of extinguishing a city under active bombardment were not the same as the mathematics of a training exercise. Some fires went out, many did not, and the ones that survived into the arrival of the main bomber stream became the signal that every subsequent aircraft used to identify its target. The British had also been working aggressively on the radio navigation problem. The British responded to the beam navigation system by sending their own Morse code signals so that aircraft crew believed they were always properly centered in the beam while they flew wildly off course. This was brilliant work, and it had real effects. But the Luftwaffe was adaptive. New navigation systems replaced older ones. When the problem became widespread, the Germans introduced a new system that worked on different principles, the WWII. Having guessed the nature of this system, from a passing mention, the British had already deployed countermeasures that rendered the system useless almost as soon as it was used. The electronic war was being fought with great skill on both sides, but it was, at its core, a war of thresholds. Each new countermeasure raised the difficulty level of the German approach. Each German adaptation lowered it again. And underneath all of it, unchanged by any of the technical jousting at the level of radio frequencies and jamming equipment, was the fundamental logic of fire. Even a pathfinder that had been blown off course by beam manipulation might still, in the right conditions, find a burning target by sight. Even a bomber that had been sent miles off the correct approach bearing might still, if an earlier raid had already begun, follow the light of the fires below it and prosecute an attack on whatever was burning. The problem was perceptual. The solution, if one existed, had to operate in the perceptual domain. It had to make a bomb aimer look down and be wrong about what he was seeing. Not confused, not uncertain, wrong, confidently, professionally, fatally wrong. And for that to happen, something had to be built, something that could stand in the darkness of the English countryside and tell a convincing lie. Colonel John Turner was not a household name. He was not a decorated combat officer, not a celebrated scientist, not a figure who appeared in newsreels or whose work was discussed in Parliament. Colonel John Turner was an engineer and retired Air Ministry officer, tasked in September 1939 with establishing a broad range of day and night decoys to mislead enemy bombers. His department within the Air Ministry was small, opaque, and deliberately obscured from the wider bureaucratic visibility that most wartime programs required. Turner worked in the space between disciplines, between engineering and psychology, between construction and intelligence, and the work he did was not easily categorized within the official structures of British air defense planning. His initial work was with dummy aircraft, airfields, and factories, the decoys for which were dubbed K sites. Turner also implemented night decoys, dubbed Q sites, which consisted of lights mounted on poles to simulate an airfield. In response to the Germans' use of incendiary bombs, Turner added fires to the Q sites, dubbing them Q-fire or QF, to add to their plausibility. The logic of this progression was clear, if unconventional. If you could make a German pilot believe a field of lights was an airfield, you could attract secondary attacks away from actual operational bases. If you added fire to the arrangement, you increased the realism. You gave the enemy something to recognize. You gave his bomb aimer a visual signature that matched what the target briefings had told him to expect. Initially very crude, the fires were controlled from a nearby concrete pillbox. The theory was that after a first wave of bombers dropped on the real target, the decoy would light fires to simulate the previous raid for further waves to home in on. This was the conceptual foundation. After Coventry, after the catastrophic demonstration of what a well-executed Pathfinder raid could do to a city in a single night, the logic was extended. Following the bombing and near destruction of Coventry in November 1940, Turner was tasked with creating decoys for 7 major cities. Turner referred to the new sites as Special Fire, or SF. The question Turner was attempting to answer was not a military question in the conventional sense. It was a question about perception. How does fire look from 6,000 meters on a November night with partial cloud and a following wind? How does the burn pattern of a city center differ from the burn pattern of a single industrial building? How wide does the visible light spread? How does it change as the fire matures from ignition to full engagement? How do the gaps, the roads, the open squares, the riverine dark of a waterway running through a burning district register from altitude? The sites were activated at night using controlled fires, flares, and smoke to replicate the glow of incendiary attacks, often ignited on elevated platforms with fuels like diesel, oil, creosote, or paraffin, to create intense blazes and thick black smoke. Turner referred to the new sites as Special Fire, or SF. However, one early site near Bristol was given the name Starfish, which subsequently became used for all of the decoys. The name, once attached to the Black Down installation on the Mendip Hills, spread through informal usage until it defined the entire program. It had the accidental character of the best operational nicknames, cryptic enough to be secure, human enough to stick. What Turner proposed was this. The sites would be constructed around 4 miles from their protection target and at least 1 mile from any other settlement. They would consist of elaborate light arrays and fires, controlled from a nearby bunker and laid out to simulate a fire-bombed town. 4 miles. That was the critical calculation. Close enough that the fire would appear to belong to the city's general location when seen from altitude. Far enough that a bomber following the decoy and dropping its load would strike open ground, not residential streets. The margin was not vast, it was not comfortable, it was the precise minimum required for the deception to work without causing a secondary catastrophe. Turner presented this proposal through channels that had almost no official visibility. He was not arguing for a new weapons system. He was not requesting fighter squadrons or radar installations. He was asking for wire and fuel and construction materials and a few acres of farmland. The resources were modest. The ambition behind them was not. Building a fake city required knowing what a real one looked like from altitude, at night, on fire. This was not information that existed in any convenient reference. It had to be assembled from multiple sources, tested against direct observation, and refined through a process that was essentially empirical. You watched a city burn, and you took notes on what you saw, and you tried to reproduce it. Bristol was target-rich for the Luftwaffe. Aside from the conurbation itself, the Bristol Aircraft Company's factory at Filton, the National Smelting Plant at Avonmouth, the Electric Power Station at Portishead, and the Parnell Aircraft Facility at Yate were significant contributors to the war economy. These targets had individual visual signatures from altitude. The docks area looked different from the factory district, which looked different from the residential terrace streets that surrounded both. A properly calibrated decoy had to account for all of this, had to suggest the right kind of target in the right kind of relationship to the surrounding urban fabric. The Mendip Hills site used fires of creosote and water to simulate incendiary bombs exploding. In addition, glow boxes were used to simulate the streets and railways of Bristol, with the light bulbs powered by electrical generators turned by Coventry Climax petrol engines contained in 2 bunkers. The glow boxes were not a minor detail. They were the element that transformed the site from a fire in a field to something that read, "From altitude as a place." A fire without context is just a fire, but a fire with a surrounding pattern of light, with linear illumination suggesting streets, with clusters suggesting built-up areas, with the negative space of open ground representing parks and waterways, becomes a city. The bomb aimer's eye, trained to read aerial geography, fills in the rest. The pattern activates recognition. The recognition overrides doubt. The network in the Mendip Hills, including the Priddy site in Somerset, operated as part of a ring of 12 decoy installations protecting Bristol and its key infrastructure, such as the Avonmouth docks. These sites employed multiple fire pans, including oil vaporizers and braziers fueled by creosote and paraffin, to simulate incendiary attacks and lure Luftwaffe bombers away from the city's aircraft factories and smelting plants. The sequence of ignition mattered as much as the components themselves. A real city under Pathfinder attack did not burst into full flame simultaneously across its surface. It lit in stages, the first incendiaries landing, small fires beginning, those fires spreading to adjacent structures, the glow intensifying and broadening over minutes. A decoy site that activated all its elements at once would present a visual signature that an experienced bomb aimer might recognize as artificial. Turner's teams had to think carefully about timing, which elements to ignite first, how quickly to build the fire profile, when to add secondary ignitions that mimicked the spread of a real blaze through a residential or industrial district. The ignition systems for the baskets and fires were ignited by low-voltage electricity controlled from a post office uniselector switching system that enabled the operator to easily select the decoy to be ignited. The control bunker was the operational center of each site, a concrete room from which a single operator, or a small team, could sequence the ignition of an entire simulated city in the precisely calibrated order that the site's designers had specified. Each site was controlled locally from a concrete pillbox, with fires lit as soon as the target town came under bombing attack. There was also an additional layer of authenticity that Turner's team incorporated into the most developed sites. To the south of Blackdown, near Tyning's Farm, lay the remains of a Zed battery, a Second World War anti-aircraft rocket launching site used to provide anti-aircraft gunfire over the decoy town to add to its authenticity. A burning city with no anti-aircraft fire coming up from it was, to an experienced Luftwaffe crew, a city that had already been suppressed. It was plausible. But a burning city with anti-aircraft fire rising from its perimeter was a city that was still fighting. That was the more compelling visual. That was the picture that matched the briefings, matched the expected resistance, matched everything the aircrew had been taught to expect over a live industrial target. The rockets added texture. They added believability to an already carefully designed lie. The first operational test of the decoy system near Bristol produced results that exceeded the projections Turner's team had made during the planning phase. And it also produced a lesson. During the first Bristol raid on November 2, 1940, the one site that was ready and waiting to light at Whitchurch remained unused, as no command was given to light it. The command structure had not yet resolved how authorization for ignition would work in real time. A site staffed and calibrated and ready was standing dark while Bristol burned, because no one had given the order. Initially, the crews had to wait for authorization, and this degraded the effectiveness of the whole system. During the first Bristol raid on November 2, 1940, the site that was ready and waiting remained unused as no command was given to light. The crews who had spent weeks building and calibrating the installation understood precisely how much the delay had cost. The main bomber stream had followed the Pathfinder fires, directly into Bristol. The docks and the aircraft factory at Filton had been struck, and in a field less than 5 miles away, a system capable of drawing those bombers away had stood cold and dark because the authorization chain had not kept pace with the operational reality of a raid already in progress. The lesson was absorbed. Protocols were changed. In the event of a breakdown of telephone communications between headquarters and Starfish Control at 80 Wing, operators were authorized to fire the minor Starfish, and if the site was attacked, to extend the fire as necessary. Every effort should then be made to inform 80 Wing as soon as contact could be re-established. This was the critical adjustment. Decentralize the ignition authority. Give the operators on the ground the ability to light their arrays when the moment demanded it, not when a distant headquarters had processed the information and issued a formal instruction. The nature of a bombing raid made precision command a liability. By the time the authorization reached the site, through whatever communications chain was available, the bomber stream might already have passed. The window might have closed. The first QF firings occurred during a raid on the city on December 2nd, when 66 high incendiary bombs fell on the decoys. 66 incendiary bombs on Somerset farmland. Not on Bristol docks. Not on the aircraft factory. Not on the residential streets near the city center where a direct hit carried consequences measured in human lives. On open ground, in the dark, where the bombs cratered soil and startled livestock and destroyed nothing that had any meaning to the British war economy. The operators in their concrete bunker had done exactly what Turner had designed the system to do. They had given the incoming bomber stream a target that looked, from 6,000 meters, exactly like the city they had come to destroy. And the bombers had believed them. By mimicking the glow of a burning urban area, the Mendip and neighboring sites successfully diverted raids during the Bristol Blitz and subsequent operations, reducing damage to vital port facilities. But the scale of what had worked over Bristol on that December night was still, in late 1940, a local achievement. One site, one city, 12 miles of separation between the truth and the lie. What Turner and the Air Ministry now understood was that the principle could be extended, the same mathematics, the same engineering logic, the same calibration of fire against visual signature. It could be applied to every major industrial city in Britain that faced systematic Luftwaffe targeting. The question was how quickly it could be built. By the middle of 1941, the Starfish program had expanded from a handful of experimental installations into a structured network covering most of Britain's major industrial centers. The number of Starfish sites built across the country increased throughout 1941, rising from 108 in March to 164 by the end of the year. By the end of the war, approximately 237 Starfish sites had been constructed across the United Kingdom, protecting 81 major targets. Each city presented its own specific problem. Bristol's visual signature from altitude was different from Birmingham's. Birmingham's was different from Liverpool's, which sat on an estuary, whose waterfront caught and reflected what light it was given, whose dock infrastructure created a particular pattern of dark and bright that a Luftwaffe navigator briefed on the Mersey could identify from the geometry alone. Sheffield's industrial profile, the steelworks, the cutlery factories, the particular density of its built environment in the Don Valley required its own solution. Turner was tasked with creating decoys for 7 major industrial centres: Bristol, Crewe, Derby, London, Manchester, Middlesbrough, and Sheffield. But the program spread beyond the original 7 as the threat evolved and as the evidence of the program's effectiveness accumulated in the operational records of raids that had struck open ground rather than protected infrastructure. By mid-1941, the program shifted from standalone SF sites, large-scale fire decoys simulating burning cities, to a coordinated network incorporating QL sites for mimicking urban and industrial illumination and smaller QF fire decoys for targeted diversions, allowing for more versatile responses to varying raid patterns. This integration expanded the program's scope from protecting key industrial centers like Sheffield and Birmingham to covering a wider array of potential targets. The classification level of the program was extraordinary even by wartime standards. Turner's department operated with a degree of institutional opacity that excluded most senior RAF officers from understanding the full scope of what had been built. The logic of this secrecy was self-evident. A decoy program whose existence was known would cease to function as a decoy. If the Luftwaffe understood that Britain had constructed fake cities in its countryside, their bomb aimers would account for that possibility. They might develop criteria for distinguishing real fires from artificial ones. They might add a layer of skepticism to the visual identification process that the entire program depended on defeating. Silence was, therefore, not merely a bureaucratic preference. It was an operational requirement. The Starfish sites had to remain unknown to work. And to remain unknown, they had to remain small, dispersed, locally administered, and deliberately invisible within the larger structure of British wartime administration. In North Staffordshire, decoy sites. Near Stoke-on-Trent, such as those at Kiel, Beach, and Caverswall, functioned from August 1941 to April 1943. Strategically positioned along German radio beam paths to intercept navigation signals aimed at the region's pottery and industrial infrastructure. The positioning of sites along known beam paths was a refinement that demonstrated how deeply Turner's teams understood the German targeting system. A site positioned along the projected route of a Nicobene or X-Gerate beam would intercept not just the visual search pattern of bomber crews, but the specific geographic expectation that the beam had created in their minds. An aircraft flying the correct beam to a target would arrive at the intersection of its navigation mathematics and its visual perception, and if a well-designed Starfish site lay at that intersection instead of the actual city, the probability of successful deception increased sharply. Glasgow's decoy network demonstrated the geographic adaptability of the program. Glasgow was protected by various Starfish sites located on its surrounding hillsides. The hillsides provided elevation, a characteristic that added realism to the fire displays, since an elevated fire above low cloud would project its light differently than a ground-level one, and the light scatter pattern would more convincingly suggest an urban area of significant extent. All of this required engineering knowledge geographic knowledge, and an evolving understanding of Luftwaffe tactics that kept pace with how German Pathfinder methods changed across the campaign. Turner's teams were not working from a fixed manual. They were learning in real time, adjusting calibration and design as each raid provided new data on what had drawn the bombers and what had not. The program was vast, meticulous, and almost entirely invisible, which was exactly what it needed to be. The men who operated the Starfish sites are among the least recorded participants in Britain's air defense during the Blitz. Most were civilian contractors. Most served in a formal anonymity that had nothing to do with official secrecy classifications and everything to do with the nature of the work itself. Unglamorous, isolated, technically specific, and characterized by long periods of complete inaction, interrupted by hours of precise, dangerous activity. Each site was staffed by a small team. Their operational routine was defined by waiting. They waited in the dark countryside, far enough from the city they were protecting that the sound of the urban blitz reached them muffled and late, mixed with the ordinary sounds of rural England at night. Wind through field grass, the occasional animal disturbance, the particular silence of open ground under overcast sky. They waited for the sound of aircraft engines. They waited for the distant thud and flash that meant the first incendiaries had landed and the Pathfinder phase was complete. They waited for the telephone or the radio, or in the case of communication failure, for their own judgment. When the observer corps and radar stations indicated that the first wave had gone and the main bomber force was approaching, the command fire Starfish was sent to the operators of the main decoy. The command, when it came, required fast hands and a knowledge of the ignition sequence that had been rehearsed, but never, until the first operational use, tested under actual raid conditions. The uni-selector switching system had been calibrated, the fire pans had been loaded, the creosote and paraffin sat in their containers waiting for a low-voltage electrical impulse to ignite them. The ignition platforms were elevated to maximize the spread of visible light and create the black smoke columns that characterized a real incendiary attack on a built-up area. The operators worked under strict radio silence in many configurations, communicating through hardwired telephone lines to the control at 80 wing when the lines held, relying on pre-established protocols when they did not. The concrete pillboxes that housed the control equipment were robust enough to offer some protection, but the sites themselves, the fire pans, the glow boxes, the elevated platforms, were exposed, and a site that had successfully drawn a bomber formation's attention had, by definition, made itself a target. According to documents released in 1979, an estimated 3,160 injuries and 2,596 deaths would have occurred had the decoys not done their work. The operators understood this arithmetic, though they would not have been shown documents that quantified it. What they understood in practical terms was that when the bombs fell, they fell close. Not on the pillbox, usually. The sites had been positioned and the fire arrays arranged so that the incoming bomb load would strike the field around the arrays, not the control point, but close enough that the ground shuddered and the air pressure moved and the night became temporarily something more violent than any rural darkness had any right to be. Frank Newberry is perhaps the last surviving person who worked on the Bristol Starfish sites as an apprentice electrician, having joined Colston Electrical the day before the first Bristol Blitz raid on November 2nd, 1940. He was one of many civilian tradesmen who built and maintained these installations, men whose professional identities as electricians and contractors did not easily encompass the specific operational character of the work they were actually doing on those Somerset hillsides. In the winter of 1940 and early 1941, this now peaceful woodland was a scene of almost biblical fire and fury. The operators who worked through those winters occupied a particular psychological territory. They could not know, on any given night, whether the bombers would come. They could not know, if the bombers came, whether the site would succeed in drawing them. They could not know, if the site drew them, whether the bombs would fall far enough from the pillbox to leave them intact. What they had was the procedure and the calibration and the switch that lit the fire. They had built the lie carefully enough that it might work. They lit it and waited to find out. After the war, when the records of both sides could be examined together, when the Luftwaffe's own bomb damage assessment reports and mission logs could be read alongside the British decoy site records and raid diaries, the picture that emerged was one of consistent, sustained confusion on the German side. The Luftwaffe had invested significant analytical effort in understanding why their precision attacks on British industrial targets were producing less measurable damage than the pre-raid photography suggested should result. Their Pathfinder aircraft had found the targets. Their navigation systems had confirmed the approach bearings. Their bomb aimers had reported fires and impact patterns consistent with successful attacks. And yet post-raid reconnaissance, where they could obtain it, showed intact factories, undamaged dock infrastructure, residential areas that should have been struck but were not. German analysts attributed these discrepancies to several factors, none of which included the possibility of systematic visual deception at the point of bomb release. Poor weather was one explanation. Cloud cover that had degraded the visibility of impact patterns. Navigation errors by individual aircraft were another. The assumption that a percentage of any bomber stream would miss its intended target regardless of Pathfinder marking quality. The effectiveness of British fire services was a third. The recognition that incendiary attacks on British cities were being extinguished more rapidly than German analysts had projected. These explanations were not entirely wrong. Weather and navigation error and British fire service capability were all real factors in the operational results of Luftwaffe raids on Britain. The analysts who constructed these explanations were working professionally with the data available to them. But the data available to them was systematically corrupted by a program they did not know existed. On the night of October 15th and 1942, during a raid by 289 aircraft against Cologne, the Germans themselves lit a decoy target indicator that deceived the majority of the main force's bombs. Only one 4,000-pound bomb, 3 smaller general-purpose bombs, and 210 incendiaries hit the city out of a force of almost 70,000 bombs in total. The Germans, in other words, had themselves experienced the effect of visual deception at the targeting moment, and had observed its effectiveness with their own analysis. What they apparently did not connect to this experience was the possibility that Britain had been doing exactly the same thing to them, more systematically and over a longer period, throughout the Blitz. In his 2000 book Fields of Deception, historian Colin Dobinson collated Turner's conservative estimates as to the success of decoy sites, suggesting that Starfish decoys diverted 968 tons of German bombardment. 968 tons. That was the conservative figure, arrived at by a historian. Working from operational logs, cross-referencing reported German bomb loads with confirmed decoy site activations and documented diversions. The figure did not include missions where the diversion produced no bomb craters and was never formally logged by the German units. It did not include raids where the outcome was ambiguous, where part of a bomb load struck a decoy site and part struck the protected city, and attribution was uncertain. It was the floor of what the program achieved, not the ceiling. And still, 968 tons of bombs on Somerset farmland, on Mendip hillsides, on the open ground outside Bristol and Birmingham and Sheffield, instead of on the factories and docks and terrace streets that housed the people who built the weapons and made the steel and kept the war going. The Germans never understood the mechanism. The anomalies in their damage assessments accumulated across the campaign without cohering into a conclusion, and in the absence of that conclusion, they continued to fly toward whatever fire was brightest in the darkness below them. The Starfish program was not infallible. Turner's teams understood this from the beginning, and the operational record confirmed it across the course of the campaign. What the sites achieved was a probabilistic improvement in the odds, a systematic reduction in the percentage of bomb loads that struck their intended targets, achieved by offering the bomber stream a competing target that was, in the right conditions, more immediately convincing than the real city the Pathfinders had marked. Those conditions were not always present. Against experienced Pathfinder crews operating on clear nights with strong beam reception and recent target photography, the sights were less effective. A Kampfgruppe 100 navigator who had flown the approach bearing to Bristol 20 times and who had the city's geographic profile embedded in operational memory was not easily deceived by a fire in a field 4 miles from the city perimeter. Not if the sky was clear enough to see the estuary, not if the approach angle revealed the correct urban outline beneath the clouds, not if the fire's position relative to the other visual references in the landscape didn't quite match the target geometry he expected. By mid-1941, the program incorporated QL sites for mimicking urban and industrial illumination alongside the fire decoys, allowing for more versatile responses to varying raid patterns. The addition of the QL sites, lighting arrays that simulated the residual illumination of a city not yet fully blacked out or caught in the confusion of an active raid, was an attempt to extend the program's effectiveness against more experienced crews to add a second layer of visual deception that reinforced the fire displays. But there were nights when the bombers found their targets regardless. There were raids on Bristol where the decoy sites activated and drew secondary elements of the attacking formation while the main effort pressed through to the city center. There were attacks on industrial targets where the Pathfinder crew's accuracy was sufficient to establish a fire so clearly centered on the actual target that no competing decoy, however well calibrated, could have redirected the stream. The system was also vulnerable to adaptation. If the Luftwaffe had developed, as they eventually might have, a systematic methodology for identifying decoy fires, if they had trained crews to look for specific characteristics that distinguished artificial fires from real ones, or if they had begun to correlate the pattern of anomalous damage assessments with the geographic locations of known decoy sites, the program's effectiveness would have degraded rapidly. Deception systems have a natural lifespan. They work until the adversary understands what they are doing. The Luftwaffe never reached that understanding. The campaign against Britain wound down before the analytical work that might have revealed the Starfish program had time to develop into operational doctrine. The German focus shifted eastward in May 1941, the period ending when the Germans moved their bomber forces to the east in preparation for the attack on the Soviet Union. The raids continued after that in varying intensity and with varying objectives. But the sustained, systematic campaign of 1940 and 1941, the campaign that the Starfish program had been built specifically to defeat, was over. And the program had worked well enough, often enough, in the conditions where it was designed to work, to matter. That distinction, worked well enough, often enough, is not a diminishment. In warfare, the margin between success and failure is rarely absolute. A defense that fails 1 time in 3 but succeeds 2 times in 3 has changed the arithmetic of the campaign, It has made the cost of attacking higher, the results of attacking lower, and the operational confidence of the attacking force less reliable than it was. The Starfish program did that. On its best nights, it did considerably more. The documentary record of the Starfish program's effectiveness is both substantial and imprecise. Substantial because the operational logs of the sites, the witness accounts of crews who staffed them, and the post-war reconstruction of German bombing records provide a picture detailed enough to be historically meaningful. Imprecise because the nature of the deception made complete accounting impossible. A bomb that fell on an empty field and cratered sheep pasture was not always formally logged by the German unit that dropped it, and a diversion that worked perfectly left no German record of the targeting decision that was deceived. Historian Colin Dobinson's collation of Turner's conservative estimates suggests that Starfish decoys diverted 968 tons of German bombardment. The word conservative is load-bearing in that sentence. Turner himself understood that many successful diversions went unrecorded. After the war, the Air Historical Branch estimated that 5% of the bombs dropped on Britain were diverted by decoys. 5% sounds modest. It is not. Applied to the total tonnage of bombs dropped on Britain during the Blitz and the campaigns that followed, 5% represents an enormous quantity of explosive and incendiary material that landed on open ground rather than on industrial infrastructure and residential streets. It represents factories that continued producing aircraft engines and munitions. It represents rail junctions that continued moving supplies and troops. It represents entire neighborhoods of terraced houses that were not reduced to the rubble that would have killed the people sleeping in them. According to documents released in 1979, an estimated 3,160 injuries and 2,596 deaths would have occurred had the decoys not done their work. Bristol's decoys were among the most effective. And it is true to say that the Starfish sites around the city saved lives in the vicinity. By the end of the Second World War, 237 decoy sites had been constructed in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and it is estimated that over 2,500 civilian lives were saved by the program's operation. These are not numbers drawn from theoretical modeling. They are calculated from the specific record of raids diverted, bomb loads redirected, and the comparison between attack patterns on cities with decoy coverage and those without. The methodology is imperfect because all historical reconstruction of counterfactual outcomes is imperfect, but the direction of the evidence is clear and the conclusions are defensible. Blackdown alone was one of 12 Starfish sites around Bristol and one of approximately 800 nationwide. 800 sites. 800 installations in open countryside, on hillsides and moorland and flat agricultural ground, staffed by small teams of men who waited in the dark for the sound of engines and the signal to light the fire. 800 exercises in the engineering of perception, each one calibrated to the specific visual signature of the city it was protecting, each one designed to offer a convincing alternative to a real target at the precise moment when an airborne decision was being made. The scale of the program, when it can be seen whole, is staggering. Not because the individual components were technologically complex, they were not by the standards of the weapon systems operating on either side of the war, but because the conception behind them was exact, because someone had thought precisely about what a German bomb aimer was seeing and feeling and deciding at the moment of attack, and had then built something designed to fit perfectly into that moment and redirect its consequence. A 1992 archaeological survey of the Mendip Hills did not identify surviving bomb craters on the Blackdown site, the original Starfish, despite earlier claims of their existence. The land has absorbed the evidence. The craters, where they existed, have been plowed over or grown over in the 80 years since the last raid. What remains on Blackdown are the bunkers, 3 concrete structures that housed the control equipment and the operators who used it. They are gated now, protected as scheduled monuments, visited occasionally by walkers who may or may not know what the structures represent. The fields around them grew back long ago. They are quiet. They were always quiet, except for those nights when the fire went up and the bombers came, and the sky above the Mendips briefly held the weight of a war that the people in that concrete room were doing their small, precise, necessary part to survive. There is a particular category of wartime achievement that resists the conventions of commemoration. It is the achievement that left nothing destroyed, no aircraft shot down, no attack repelled in the visible, recordable manner of a fighter engagement or an artillery duel. No moment of decisive confrontation that can be marked on a timeline and called a battle. The Starfish program produced its results through absence, through raids that struck empty fields, through bomb loads that detonated against sheep pasture and heather moorland and the indifferent soil of the English countryside, through German damage assessment reports that recorded successful attacks on cities that had not, in fact, been significantly struck, through the accumulated negative space of all the things that did not happen, the factories that kept running, the docks that kept loading, the streets that stayed standing, because a fire in a field had convinced a bomb aimer for 60 seconds of his life that he was somewhere he was not. The Starfish program succeeded because it understood the Luftwaffe's targeting system at the level where that system was most precisely itself, not at the level of aircraft or navigation equipment or command structure, at the level of a human being, alone at an altitude of 6,000 meters, looking down at fire and deciding what it meant. The program was spearheaded by Colonel John Turner under the Air Ministry's Deceptions Unit, with sites strategically placed in rural areas near key population centers to maximize misdirection. Turner was an engineer. He thought in the language of materials and calibration and spatial geometry. But the problem he was solving was not an engineering problem in the conventional sense. It was a problem of human cognition under operational conditions. It was a problem of what the eye recognizes and what the mind confirms and what the hand does in response. He solved it with creosote and paraffin and electrical wire and low-voltage ignition circuits and glow boxes arranged to suggest the linear geometry of streets. He solved it with concrete bunkers buried in hillsides and small teams of civilian contractors who knew how to follow a sequence and wait for a signal. He solved it with 4 miles of separation between the truth and the lie. Just enough distance to place the bomb load in empty ground, just close enough to make the lie believable from altitude. The Air Historical Branch estimated that 5% of the bombs dropped on Britain were diverted by the decoy program. 5%, measured in tonnage, represents a weight of destruction that was taken off the cities and set down on open ground. It represents the margin, narrow, fought for, quietly maintained across years of operations, between what happened to Britain's industrial capacity during the Blitz and what might have happened had the bomber streams always found exactly what they were looking for. The weapon was not a gun. It was not a fighter aircraft or a radar installation or a jamming transmitter. It was an understanding, precise, patient, built from observation and engineering judgment and a willingness to work in the dark on something that most people in the chain of command did not fully know existed. In the winter of 1940 and early 1941, that now peaceful hillside woodland was a scene of almost biblical fire and fury. The men in the bunker lit the fire. The bombers came. The bombs fell on the Somerset dark. And in Bristol, 12 miles away, the city breathed. The bombers never knew. The analysts never understood why the damage never matched the attack. The records they kept were records of a deception so complete that it could not be detected from inside the deception itself. There are 3 concrete bunkers still standing on Blackdown in the Mendip Hills. They are scheduled monuments now. Most people who walk past them do not know what they are or what was done from inside them. The fields around them are ordinary fields. The sky above them is ordinary sky. But on some winter nights, when the cloud sits low on the hills and the dark comes in fast across the Somerset levels, it is possible to stand on that hillside and understand, in some small way, what it meant to light a fire in a field and offer it to the bombers as a city, to build something that looked, from the altitude of a Heinkel flying at 6,000 meters through the freezing English dark, exactly like the thing you were trying to protect, to make the lie so convincing that the truth survived. That is what Turner's program was. That is what the men in those bunkers did, night after night, across the years of the Blitz and into the campaigns that followed. They lit their fires, they held their silence, they listened to the bombs fall in the field around them, and when it was over, and the all clear sounded somewhere in the distance, and the sky went quiet again, they sat in their concrete room and waited to find out whether the city was still there. It usually was.